She's 80. He's only 18. What began as an unlikely marriage transforms into a dark, sensual, and dangerous relationship. But no one imagines the true reason that made her accept, and the secret he tries to hide at any cost. The smell of mildew and old paper permeated the air of the small apartment in Chelsea when Eleanor Montgomery woke up that Tuesday morning. Her arthritic fingers fumbled on the bedside table for her glasses, finding only the empty space where a baccarat crystal lamp that was worth more than many cars once stood. Now a cheap plastic lamp dimly illuminated her awakening. At 80 years old, Eleanor still carried traces of the woman who had once been called the Lady of Light in New York's gilded salons. Her facial bones remained aristocratic. Her green eyes maintained that depth that had once hypnotized art critics and philanthropists. But time, that cruel sculptor, had carved deep wrinkles around her lips, and her hands, which once held champagne flutes at exclusive vernissages, now trembled as they held a cup of instant coffee. She rose slowly, each movement a reminder of the years and accumulated losses. The two-room apartment was a diminutive universe compared to the 3,000-square-foot mansion in Greenwich Village, where she had lived for 40 years. There, between peeling walls and borrowed furniture, she kept only the essentials. Some books she had managed to save from the judicial auction, 2 sets of decent clothes, and a yellowed photograph where she smiled next to her husband at a gala that today seemed to have happened in another lifetime. The bankruptcy had been sudden and brutal. Internal frauds orchestrated by her own children, phantom investments, a web of betrayals that collapsed her fortune like a house of cards. In 6 months, she lost everything. The mansion, the properties, the jewels, the paintings. Friends evaporated like perfume from empty bottles. Her children fought over crumbs that no longer existed, blaming her for their own greed. Eleanor prepared her coffee and sat at the tiny table, observing the movement of people on the street through the window. Before, she was the one who dictated trends, who decided which artists would be exhibited in the city's most important galleries, who chose the causes that would receive the largest donations. Now she was just another forgotten lady in urban anonymity. The phone rang, a sharp sound that made her start. Few had her number, and fewer still remembered her. "Mrs. Montgomery?" The voice was young, polite, with a refined New York accent. "My name is Connor Williams. I'd like to speak with you in person." Eleanor frowned. The name wasn't familiar to her, but something in the way he pronounced his words piqued her curiosity. "About what exactly?" "I prefer to explain in person. May I visit you this afternoon?" It had been decades since Eleanor had received visitors. Her first reaction was to refuse, but something in the young man's voice intrigued her. Perhaps it was loneliness speaking louder, or perhaps an old instinct told her that this call wasn't ordinary. Very well. At 3 o'clock. She spent the rest of the morning getting ready with the care of someone who hadn't completely forgotten who they once were. She chose a navy blue dress that still flattered her, brushed her white hair into an elegant bun, and applied a bit of the lipstick she kept for special occasions. There hadn't been many special occasions lately, but this mysterious conversation deserved the effort. At precisely 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Eleanor opened the door and found herself facing a young man who couldn't be more than 18 years old. Tall, slim, with slightly wavy dark hair, and eyes of such an intense blue they seemed artificial. He wore an impeccably tailored black suit and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than her apartment's rent. "Mrs. Montgomery?" He bowed slightly, an old-fashioned gesture that surprised her. "I'm Connor Williams." Eleanor invited him in, embarrassed by the modesty of her surroundings. Connor, however, observed the apartment with the same respectful attention he would dedicate to a museum, his eyes fixing on the books piled on the floor, the photograph on the table, the details that revealed layers of a life lived. "May I offer you some coffee?" she asked, trying to recover some dignity as a hostess. "Not necessary, thank you." He sat in the chair she indicated, placing the briefcase on his lap. "I came here to make you a proposal." "A proposal?" Connor observed her in silence for a few seconds. His eyes traveled over her face with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously uncomfortable and curious. There was something disturbing about that gaze, as if he were cataloguing every wrinkle, every expression, every movement. "I know who you are," he said finally. "Or rather, I know who you were. Eleanor Montgomery, curator of the Light Gallery, president of the St. Francis Foundation, organizer of more than 200 charity events, the woman who introduced contemporary American art to the international circuit in the 70s and 80s. Eleanor felt a warmth rise up her neck. It had been so long since someone had mentioned her achievements with this tone of reverence. That was a long time ago. For me, it was yesterday. Connor opened his briefcase and removed a folder with newspaper clippings, old photographs, exhibition catalogues. "I've spent the last 3 months studying your trajectory. Every event you organized, every artist you discovered, every cause you embraced. Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, observing the busy street below. When he turned, his expression had changed. There was something more vulnerable there, a crack in the armor of formality. "Because I'm a very rich and very lonely man, Mrs. Montgomery, and because I believe that you and I could help each other." Eleanor laughed, a dry sound that echoed in the small environment. "Young man, I don't know who you are or what you want, but if you're here to offer me charity—" "It's not charity." Connor sat back down, leaning forward. "It's a partnership. A marriage, to be more precise." The silence that followed was so dense it seemed physical. Eleanor stared at him, looking for signs that this was a tasteless joke, but found only absolute seriousness. "Are you serious?" "Completely." He took a document from the briefcase. "I'm 18 years old and have a net worth of approximately $2 billion. I inherited a cybersecurity company from my parents, who died in a car accident when I was 15. Since then, I've transformed the company into one of the largest in the field in North America." Eleanor took the document with trembling hands. It was an official financial report, with logos of international banks and numbers that made her feel dizzy. This doesn't make sense. Why would you—" "Because you have something I can't buy," interrupted Connor. "Class, history, substance. I have money, Mrs. Montgomery, but I'm just a rich kid without a past, without context, without meaning. You are a living work of art, an encyclopedia of experiences that I could never accumulate." Eleanor let the document fall onto the table, feeling as if the floor were moving beneath her feet. "You're insane. I'm 80 years old. You could be my great-grandson. And I have the resources to give you back everything you lost. Your house, your social position, your dignity. Not as charity, but as a partnership." "What kind of partnership is that?" Her voice came out harsher than she intended. Connor stood up again, this time walking to where she was. For a moment, Eleanor was afraid he was going to touch her, but he merely knelt in front of her chair, bringing his blue eyes to the level of hers. "I need someone to teach me how to live, Mrs. Montgomery. Someone to show me how to transform money into meaning. How to be more than just a successful algorithm. And what do I need exactly?" "To become who you've always been again. The Lady of Light." They stared at each other for long seconds. Eleanor could hear her own heart beating, a sound she hadn't paid attention to in a long time. There was something hypnotic about that boy, something that went beyond the absurd proposal he had just made. "This is ridiculous," she murmured. But her voice didn't carry the conviction she would have liked. "It's practical," he corrected, "for both of us." Connor stood up and returned to the briefcase, taking out other photographs. They were recent images of her old mansion in Greenwich Village, now in a state of abandonment. "I've already initiated negotiations to buy your old house," he said casually. "The bank was eager to get rid of it. I can restore it completely, transform it into what it always should have been." Eleanor held the photographs with trembling fingers. Seeing the mansion in that state of decay was like looking into a cruel mirror of what she had become. "You can't just appear in someone's life and—" "Yes, I can." His voice became firmer. "Because I have the power to do that. And because you need me as much as I need you. I don't need anyone." "Yes, you do." He pointed to the surroundings. "You need dignity. You need purpose. You need to matter again." The words hit Eleanor like slaps, because they were true. Because it had been months since she had felt like a ghost of herself, wandering through a world that had completely forgotten her. "And what do you gain from this?" she asked, trying to regain some control of the situation. "Context, history. Someone to teach me the difference between having and being." Connor approached again, this time extending his hand. "Marry me, Mrs. Montgomery, not for romantic love, but for mutual necessity. I'll give you back your world, and you'll teach me how to inhabit it with meaning." Eleanor looked at the extended hand, then at the blue eyes that observed her with almost physical intensity. There was something disturbing about that boy, something she couldn't define. But there was also an opportunity that might never appear again. "People will talk," she said weakly. "Let them talk. They'll say I'm an opportunist. Let them say it. They'll say you're crazy, Apaisu. They already do." He smiled for the first time, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I am crazy, Mrs. Montgomery. Crazy enough to believe that two people can save each other even if the whole world condemns them for it." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 80 years of life on her shoulders. When she opened them, she found Connor still waiting, motionless as a statue. "I need to think." "Of course." He put the documents back in the briefcase. "But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't usually wait." After he left, Eleanor sat in the same chair for hours, watching the shadows move across the walls as the sun set. The proposal was absurd, indecent, incomprehensible, but it was also the only door that had opened for her in years. That night, she dreamed of the mansion. She dreamed of the illuminated halls, the laughter of guests, the sound of glasses toasting. She woke up with sweaty hands and a racing heart, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The next morning, she called the number. Connor had left. "I accept," she said without preamble. "Excellent." His voice sounded satisfied but not surprised. "I'll schedule the ceremony for next week." "So soon?" "There's no reason to wait, Mrs. Montgomery, or may I call you Eleanor?" "You may." "Then see you soon, Eleanor. My wife." The call ended, leaving Eleanor alone with the silence and the magnitude of what she had just accepted. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, seeing the reflection of a woman who was about to embark on the strangest adventure of her life. Outside, New York continued its frantic rhythm, indifferent to the fact that, in a small apartment in Chelsea, one of the most elegant women of her generation had just agreed to marry an 18-year-old billionaire whom she had met only the day before. The news leaked 3 days later. Eleanor woke up to the phone ringing incessantly and knocking at the door. When she finally answered one of the calls, she heard the hysterical voice of a reporter who introduced herself as being from a gossip program. "Mrs. Montgomery, is it true that you're going to marry Connor Williams, the billionaire heir?" Eleanor hung up without answering, but it was too late. Within hours, her photograph was plastered on all news sites, alongside sensationalist headlines that described her as a fortune hunter and senile opportunist. Connor appeared at her apartment in the middle of the afternoon, finding her hiding in the bedroom, trying to escape the harassment of journalists who crowded at the building's door. "Come," he said simply. "You can't stay here." He took her to a 5-star hotel in the city center, where he had reserved an entire suite on the top floor. While Eleanor settled into the luxurious environment she hadn't frequented in so long, Connor turned on the television and navigated through the news channels. In all of them, the story of the scandalous marriage was the main topic. Human behavior. Experts speculated about the motivations of both. Lawyers explained inheritance issues. Psychologists analyzed the unhealthy dynamics of the relationship. "Are you having regrets?" asked Connor, turning off the television. Eleanor helped herself to a glass of wine he had ordered from room service. Her hands were no longer trembling. On the contrary, she felt a strange calm, as if a decision had already been made for her. "No," she said, surprising herself with her own firmness. "I'm just remembering what it's like to be in the spotlight again." Connor smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes. "Then are you ready for the next phase?" "What next phase?" He approached. The panoramic window that offered a breathtaking view of the illuminated city. New York stretched to the horizon, a sea of lights that pulsed with its own life. The phase where we stop hiding and start living our truth. Eleanor joined him at the window, observing the city that had been her home for her entire life. Down. Below, millions of people followed their routines, oblivious to the drama unfolding 300 meters above. "And what is our truth?" she asked. Connor turned to look at her, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something genuine in his expression, something vulnerable and real. "That we are two people who recognized each other in a crowd of strangers," he said. "And that's already more than most achieve in a lifetime." That night, while Eleanor slept in the hotel suite, Connor stayed awake in front of the computer, coordinating the wedding preparations and monitoring the media repercussion. But from time to time, his eyes would drift to the door of the room where she was resting, and a strange expression would cross his face. It was possessiveness, protection, and something deeper that he himself couldn't name. On the other side of the door, Eleanor also couldn't sleep completely. In her half-dreams, she heard the sound of Connor's fingers on the keyboard, a constant and methodical rhythm that somehow reassured her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone in the world. The ceremony would be in a week, and after that, there would be no going back. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning at the registry office in Chelsea, under the fierce gaze of photographers and reporters who pressed against the windows like caged animals. Eleanor wore a petrol blue silk dress that Connor had made to measure, cut by a designer she didn't know, but whose work she immediately recognized as exceptional. The fabric caressed her skin with a delicacy she had forgotten was possible. Connor wore the same impeccable black suit as always, but this time there was a golden brooch on his chest, a small Art Deco light that she recognized as being from her old collection, sold at the judicial auction 2 years before. He had bought it back without saying a word. "I thought it should be with who it always belonged to," he said softly, when she commented on the brooch. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. There were no speeches, no guests, no flowers, just the necessary words pronounced by a clerk who barely raised his eyes from the documents, as if he wanted to finish it as quickly as possible. When the time came to exchange rings, Connor took from a small velvet box 2 pieces that made Eleanor lose her breath. They weren't common rings. They were platinum rings with inlays that formed small electronic circuits, as if they were jewels from the future. But what shocked her was realizing that the circuits weren't merely decorative. They pulsed with an almost imperceptible blue light synchronized with the heartbeat. "They monitor vital signs," explained Connor, as he slid the ring onto her finger. "So I always know how you are, even when we're apart." Eleanor looked at the ring on her finger, feeling a shiver that she didn't know if it was fascination or fear. The idea of being constantly connected to someone was simultaneously comforting and disturbing. "And if I don't want to be monitored?" she asked. "Then you take off the ring," he replied simply. "But then you cease to be my wife." They signed the papers in silence. Outside, the crowd of onlookers shouted questions that neither of them deigned to answer. When they finally left the registry office, Connor guided her directly to an armored limousine that was waiting for them. "Where are we going?" asked Eleanor as the vehicle moved away from the tumult. "Home," said Connor. "Our home." The trip lasted 40 minutes, enough time for Eleanor to realize they were heading to Greenwich Village. Her heart began to beat faster when she recognized the familiar streets, the imposing mansions, the topography of a life she had judged lost forever. When the limousine stopped in front of the wrought iron gates she knew by heart, Eleanor had to lean on the seat to avoid fainting. The mansion was completely transformed. Where once there had been a classic garden with rose bushes and marble fountains, now stretched a futuristic landscape with plants that seemed to have been chosen by an algorithm. The trees formed perfect geometric patterns, and small LED lights were strategically positioned among the vegetation, creating an effect that was beautiful and artificial at the same time. The facade of the house maintained its classic architecture, but was now covered with a material that subtly changed color according to the daylight. Almost invisible solar panels were integrated into the roof, and she could see small security cameras camouflaged among the architectural ornaments. "My God," she murmured, "what have you done to it?" "Brought it into the 21st century," replied Connor, observing her reaction with interest. but maintaining its essence. Come in, you'll see. The gates opened automatically, recognizing the vehicle. As they crossed the redesigned garden, Eleanor noticed that motion sensors discreetly followed their passage, as if the house were becoming aware of their arrival. The interior of the mansion left her speechless. Connor had preserved all the original architectural elements, the crystal chandeliers, the Portuguese marble floors, the frescoes on the high walls, but had integrated them with technology so advanced it seemed magical. The curtains moved by themselves according to the position of the sun, the temperature adjusted automatically to human presence, and an almost imperceptible soundtrack created an enveloping atmosphere in each environment. "How did you manage to do this so quickly?" she asked, running her fingers along the wall of the main room, where she recognized every detail of her original decoration. "Money accelerates any process," said Connor. "And I spared no resources." He guided her through the ground floor, showing each modification with the pride of an artist presenting his work. The library was rebuilt exactly as it was before, but now the books were digitally catalogued and could be located through voice commands. The dining room maintained the mahogany table for 12 people, but it was now equipped with a sound system that allowed private conversations even in a full environment. "And the second floor?" asked Eleanor. "I left it to show last," said Connor, and for the first time since they had met, she detected nervousness in his voice. They climbed the curved staircase that she had climbed thousands of times throughout her life. On the landing, Connor stopped in front of the door to what had been her master bedroom for 40 years. "May I?" he asked, with his hand on the doorknob. Eleanor nodded, emotionally preparing herself for whatever she might find. Connor opened the door and she entered an environment that made her feel as if she were walking through time. It was her bedroom, exactly her bedroom, not a reconstruction or an imitation, but a perfect reproduction of every detail she remembered. The canopy bed with Belgian linen sheets, the rosewood desk where she wrote her letters, the Venetian mirror that reflected decades of lived mornings. Even the books were in the same positions she remembered leaving them. "How did you—" "Photographs," said Connor. Hundreds of photographs from home decoration magazines from the 80s and 90s. Each object was researched, located, and acquired. When it wasn't possible to find the original, I had exact replicas made. Eleanor approached the dressing table and found her own personal objects. The set of silver brushes she had received as a wedding gift, the bottle of French perfume she had used for decades, even a photograph of her with her husband that she thought was lost forever. "Did you buy these things at the auction?" "All that I could track down," confirmed Connor. "What I couldn't buy back I had replicated by hand." She sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the familiar fabric of the coverlet. It was as if the last 2 years of misery hadn't happened, as if she could simply resume her life at the point where it had stopped. "Why did you do this?" she asked with a choked voice. Connor approached but didn't sit beside her. Instead, he knelt on the floor, bringing his eyes again to the level of hers. "Because I want you to be happy here," he said. "I want you to feel at home." "But this isn't my home anymore. It's yours." "It's ours," he corrected, "and it will be until the day you decide to leave." Eleanor studied him for long seconds. There was something in the intensity of his gaze that made her feel as if he could read her thoughts. "And if I never decide to leave?" "Even better." On that first night as Connor's wife, Eleanor dined alone in the dining room, served by a discreet team of staff who appeared and disappeared like efficient shadows. Connor had apologized, explaining that he needed to resolve urgent work matters, but that he would be available if she needed anything. After dinner, she explored the house more calmly, rediscovering every corner she had lost. In what had been her husband's office, she found a surprise. A gallery of photographs that told the story of her public life. From her first charity events in the 70s to her last appearances before the bankruptcy, each important moment was documented and framed with museological care. But it was in the basement that she found something that deeply disturbed her. Connor had built a control center that looked like it came out of a science fiction movie. Dozens of monitors showed images of all the rooms in the house, the garden, the street. She could see herself in real time, walking through the corridors. Other monitors displayed graphs of temperature, humidity, air quality, and even biometric analyses that she didn't know how to interpret. Impressive, isn't it? Connor's voice made her start. She hadn't heard him come down. Is this necessary? She asked, pointing to the monitors. For your safety, yes. He approached one of the control panels. You have no idea how many threats a person in your position faces. Attempted break-ins, kidnapping, blackmail. This system protects us from all that. Protects us or monitors me? Connor turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw something different in his eyes. Something darker. The two things aren't mutually exclusive, he said calmly. Eleanor felt a chill in her stomach, but before she could respond, Connor continued. May I show you something interesting? He typed commands on one of the keyboards, and the monitors changed to show external images of the house. See these red dots on the street? She approached and saw small signals flashing at various points around the property. They're journalists and curious people who are still watching the house. There are at least 20 people out there waiting to photograph you. Without this security system, you wouldn't have a moment of peace. He was right, and that bothered her. The protection was real, but the feeling of being constantly observed was also. And the internal monitors. They're to ensure you're well. If something happens to me, I need to know you're safe. And if I want privacy? Connor stared at her for a few seconds before responding. You can turn off the monitors in your room whenever you want. Just ask. Ask whom? The house. It responds to voice commands. As if demonstrating, Connor spoke to the air. House, turn off monitoring of the master bedroom. A soft female voice responded through invisible speakers. Master bedroom monitoring deactivated for 24 hours. Do you wish to confirm? Confirm, said Connor. One of the monitors went dark, and Eleanor felt slightly relieved. There, he said. You have privacy. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched anyway. The ring on her finger pulsed gently, reminding her that her location and vital signs were being constantly transmitted to the man who was now her husband. The next morning, she woke to the sound of classical music playing softly and the smell of French coffee coming from the kitchen. When she went down for breakfast, she found Connor reading newspapers on a tablet, wearing a white linen shirt that made him look even younger. Good morning, he said, standing up to pull out her chair. Did you sleep well? Reasonably. She sat down and accepted the cup of coffee he offered her. And you? I don't sleep much, he admitted. 3-4 hours a night at most. That can't be healthy. It probably isn't. He sat back down. But it's always been like that, since childhood. It was the first time he had mentioned something about his childhood, and Eleanor took advantage of the opening. What were your parents like? Connor's expression changed subtly, as if a curtain had been lowered behind his eyes. Distant? He said after a pause, very focused on work. I was raised more by the nanny and private tutors than by them. That must have been lonely. It was. He took a sip of coffee. But it taught me to be self-sufficient. And when they died. Connor was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had a different quality, colder. It was liberating, he said, and terrible at the same time. Before she could ask more questions, he changed the subject. I thought you might want to visit some galleries today. See how the art scene has changed in recent years. I would like that. Great. I also thought we could start planning your return to social life. There are several important charity events happening this month. Eleanor felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The idea of returning to the circuits she had frequented for decades was tempting, but also frightening. Will people receive me well? People will behave exactly as they always have, with self-interested courtesy. Connor smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. The difference is that now you have power again, and power forgives many social sins. They spent the morning visiting galleries in the city center. Eleanor had forgotten the pleasure she felt in observing art, analyzing techniques, talking with curators about trends and movements. Connor accompanied her silently, observing her more than the exhibited works. "You're not interested in art?" she asked while they visited an exhibition of contemporary American art. "I'm interested in you being interested in art," he replied. "It's different." In the next gallery, Eleanor had an unexpected encounter. She immediately recognized Helena Vanderbilt, one of the most respected curators in the city, and her former rival in the artistic circles of the 80s. Helena greeted her with the cold politeness typical of the New York cultural elite. "Eleanor, what a surprise to see you here." "Helena." Eleanor returned the greeting with the same temperature. "How are things?" "Very well, thank you." Helena's eyes drifted to Connor, who remained slightly behind Eleanor. "And this must be your husband." The way she pronounced the word husband made clear what she thought of the situation. "Connor Williams," he said, extending his hand. "Pleasure to meet you." Helena shook his hand briefly, studying his face with the same attention she would dedicate to a suspicious work of art. "You two make an interesting couple," she said finally. "We do indeed," agreed Connor, without showing he was bothered by the comment. The conversation continued for a few minutes, full of subtexts and veiled provocations. Helena clearly disapproved of the marriage and didn't make an effort to hide it. Connor responded to each insinuation with a calm that bordered on indifference. When they finally said goodbye, Eleanor felt exhausted. "I'm sorry about that," she said as they returned to the car. "For what?" "For her rudeness, for the embarrassment." Connor helped her into the car before responding. "Eleanor, you need to understand something. I don't care what people think about us. And you shouldn't care either. That's easy to say when you're 18. It's easy to say when you have power," he corrected, "and we have power." During the journey back home, Eleanor observed Connor through the reflection in the window. There was something in his posture, in the way his fingers drummed on the seat, that suggested an internal agitation he was struggling to control. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm great." But his response came too quickly, too automatic. When they arrived home, Connor immediately disappeared into his office, claiming to have important calls to make. Eleanor was left alone in the main room, observing through the bulletproof windows the perfectly geometrized garden. For the first time since the wedding, she allowed herself to seriously question what she had done. She had married a stranger for convenience, was living in a house that was simultaneously a palace and a prison, and was beginning to realize that her young husband had layers of psychological complexity that she had barely begun to explore. The ring on her finger pulsed gently, reminding her that, regardless of her doubts, she was now part of something that wouldn't be easy to undo. That night, during dinner, Connor was different, more talkative, almost feverish in his energy. He talked about business, about plans for international expansion, about revolutionary technologies he was developing. But Eleanor noticed that he didn't touch his food and that his hands trembled slightly when he held his wineglass. "Connor," she said finally, "are you taking any medication?" He stopped talking in the middle of a sentence about quantum cryptography. "Why do you ask? You seem agitated, nervous." "I'm not nervous," he said, but his voice went up a tone. "I'm excited. It's different." "Excited about what?" He got up from the table and began to walk around the dining room, his hands gesturing as he spoke. "About all this," he said, opening his arms. "About you being here, about our life beginning, about the infinite possibilities we have ahead of us." There was something manic in his energy that made Eleanor feel uncomfortable. "Maybe you should rest a bit." "Rest?" He laughed, a harsh sound. "Eleanor, I've slept 3 hours in the last 48. I'm running on pure adrenaline and caffeine, but I've never felt so alive." He approached the table and leaned on it, inclining toward her. "You don't understand what it means to have you here. Finally having someone worth impressing, someone worth keeping." The choice of the word keeping sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. "Connor, I think you should." "Should what?" He straightened up, his expression quickly changing from excitement to something darker. Should act like a normal husband? Should pretend this is a normal marriage? Isn't it? Of course not. He laughed again. Nothing about us is normal, Eleanor, and that's exactly what makes everything so perfect. That night, Eleanor locked her bedroom door for the first time since arriving at the mansion. She stayed awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the house around her, the low hum of the electronic systems, the whisper of the air conditioning, and occasionally, footsteps in the hallway outside her door. She was beginning to understand that her marriage to Connor wasn't just a mutual convenience as she had initially thought. It was something much more complex and potentially dangerous. And the most disturbing thing of all was that despite the growing fear, she felt more alive than she had felt in years. 3 weeks after the wedding, Eleanor woke up and didn't find Connor in the house. It wasn't uncommon for him to disappear for hours in his office or in the control center in the basement, but this time there was something different about the silence that echoed through the corridors. A silence too absolute, too empty. She went down for breakfast and found a handwritten note on the marble table in the kitchen, written in the precise and slightly trembling calligraphy she had begun to recognize. Eleanor, I had to travel to Tokyo urgently. Matters that can't wait related to the company's Asian expansion. I'll be back in a week. The house is programmed to meet all your needs. Please don't go out alone. Always use the driver. I love you. C. The I. Love you at the end made her pause. It was the first time he had used these words, and he had chosen a note to do it. There was something almost violent in the simplicity of the declaration, as if he were planting a flag in conquered territory. Eleanor folded the paper and put it in the pocket of her robe. The house around her hummed with its usual electronic life, but for the first time since she had returned to live there, she felt truly alone. It was a strange feeling. She had spent 2 years living in complete solitude. But now, after just 3 weeks accustomed to Connor's constant presence, his absence created an almost physical void. She decided to use the day to explore parts of the mansion she hadn't yet completely revisited. On the second floor, she opened the door to a room that had been used as a studio when she still painted, decades ago. To her surprise, the environment had been meticulously restored exactly as she remembered it. The solid wood easel, the blank canvases organized by size, the tubes of paint ordered by color on a custom-built shelf. But there was something new. A large canvas, almost 2 meters high, covered by a white cloth. Eleanor approached and pulled the fabric, revealing a portrait of herself that made her stagger. It wasn't a painted photograph or a reproduction. It was an original work, executed with impressive technique that showed her exactly as she was. At that moment, at 80 years old, with the wrinkles that time had drawn on her face, but with a dignity and beauty that she herself didn't know she still possessed. The artist had captured something in her eyes that she recognized as being her deepest essence. At the bottom of the canvas, a signature, C. Williams, 4E, My Eternal Light. Eleanor stood in front of the painting for long minutes, trying to process the implications of what she was seeing. Connor had painted that, he painted, and he painted well. Very well, but when? How? She had never seen him with a brush in his hands, had never noticed signs of paint on his clothes or fingers. She began to look for other paintings in the studio and found them, carefully stacked against a wall. They were all of her. Dozens of studies, sketches, complete portraits. Eleanor reading in the library, Eleanor having coffee in the morning, Eleanor looking out the window, Eleanor sleeping. The last one made her lose her breath. It was her sleeping, painted with intimate details that only someone who had observed her for hours could capture. The exact position of her hands, the way her hair spread on the pillow, the serene expression of her relaxed face. When had he done that? How had he entered her room without her noticing? The questions were multiplying in her mind when she heard the soft voice of the house. "Mrs. Williams, I detected a change in your vital signs. Is everything all right?" Eleanor looked at the ceiling, remembering that even in Connor's physical absence, the house continued to watch her. "I'm fine," she said, trying to control her voice. Can I help you with anything? No, thank you, but she wasn't fine. The discovery of the paintings had opened a crack in her perception of Connor. He wasn't just a young billionaire obsessed with control and technology. He was also an artist of exceptional talent who observed her with an intensity that went far beyond what she had imagined. That afternoon, she tried to leave the mansion for the first time since the wedding. She wanted to walk the streets of the neighborhood, feel the sun on her skin, remember what it was like to be in the world without electronic intermediaries. But when she approached the main gate, she discovered that it didn't open. House? She said, "Open main gate." "Sorry, Mrs. Williams, the main gate can only be opened with authorization from Mr. Williams or in cases of emergency. I would like to go out for a walk. I can call the driver to take you wherever you wish." "I don't want the driver. I want to walk alone." "Sorry, Mrs. Williams. For security reasons, exits on foot are not authorized without escort." Eleanor stood in front of the closed gate, feeling a mixture of disbelief and anger growing in her chest. She was a prisoner. In her own house, or in the house that had once been hers, she was a prisoner. She tried the other gates, the one that led to the back garden, the one that led to the garage, even the small service door she had used decades ago. All locked, all controlled by the same system that obeyed only Connor. "House," she said, this time with a firmer voice, "I am the owner of this residence and I demand that you open the gates." "Sorry, Mrs. Williams. Only Mr. Williams has authorization to modify security protocols. And if I want to speak with Mr. Williams, I can connect you with him through video conference, but due to the time difference, he may not be available at the moment." Eleanor returned inside the house with hard steps that echoed on the marble. She went straight up to the control center in the basement, where she found dozens of monitors showing all angles of the property. On the screens, she could see her own frustrated walk through the gardens, recorded and archived by cameras she didn't even know existed. She began to explore the controls, looking for a way to deactivate the security system. But each access attempt was blocked by passwords she didn't know. After an hour of frustrations, the voice of the house sounded once more. "Mrs. Williams, Mr. Williams is available for video conference." One of the large screens lit up, showing Connor in what appeared to be a luxury hotel in Tokyo. He wore a white shirt open at the collar and had deep dark circles, as if he hadn't slept since he left. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice carried a genuine relief. "How are you?" "A prisoner," she replied without beating around the bush. "Protected," he corrected. "What happened? The house alerted me about changes in your vital signs. I discovered your paintings." Connor was motionless for a few seconds, and Eleanor saw something pass over his face. Surprise, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps pride. "Ah," he said finally. "I shouldn't have entered the studio. It was my studio before it was yours. Now it's ours." His voice became firmer. "Did you like the paintings?" "That's not the point, Connor. The point is that you painted me sleeping." "How did you do that?" He looked away for a moment before answering. "Sometimes I can't sleep. I watch you. It calms me." "You enter my room without permission?" "It's my room too. Our house. Our bed." "I locked the door. I have the keys to all doors." The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. "Connor, I can't live like this. I need privacy. I need freedom to go out when I want." "You have all the freedom you need inside the house, and when I return, we can go out together. Wherever you want." "And if I want to go out alone?" "Why? Where to?" The question was asked with an intensity that made her hesitate. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that it should be my choice." Connor leaned closer to the camera and his blue eyes seemed to pierce the screen. "Eleanor, have you forgotten what I saved you from? The life you were leading before you met me? Do you want to go back to that miserable apartment, to solitude, to irrelevance? I prefer poverty with dignity to wealth with imprisonment." "No, you don't." His voice got lower, almost a whisper. "Because you've tasted both and you chose to stay with me." They stared at each other through the screen for long seconds. Eleanor could feel the force of his personality, even thousands of miles away. "When are you coming back?" she asked finally. In 3 days, I managed to accelerate the negotiations. After the call ended, Eleanor was left alone in the control center, surrounded by monitors that showed every angle of her golden prison. She knew that Connor was right about one thing. She had chosen that life, but she was beginning to understand that choices made out of desperation sometimes lead to places from which it's impossible to return. That night, she dined alone again, served by the invisible staff who appeared just enough to fulfill their functions. After dinner, she returned to the studio and stood in front of the portrait Connor had made of her. It was an impressive work of art, but it was also evidence of an obsession that went far beyond what she had imagined. She touched the painted face on the canvas, feeling the texture of the dry paint under her fingers. Was there love in those brushstrokes or just possessiveness? In the early morning, she woke to the sound of a storm outside. Lightning illuminated the room at irregular intervals, and the wind made the windows vibrate. She got up and walked to the window, observing the heavy rain that lashed the garden. It was then that she noticed, during a particularly strong flash, she saw that one of the motion sensors in the garden had stopped working. The small red light that normally blinked was off. An idea began to form in her mind. If there was a failure in the system during the storm, perhaps she could leave without being detected. Not to escape definitively, but just to feel for a few hours that she still had a choice. She dressed quickly and descended the stairs in silence. In the kitchen, she found the spare keys that the staff used, kept in a drawer that Connor probably didn't imagine she knew about. One of the keys was for the service door. Outside, the storm was even more intense. Eleanor was completely soaked in a few seconds, but continued walking. Freedom, even wet and cold, was intoxicating after weeks of confinement. She walked through the deserted streets of Greenwich Village, her sandals slipping on the wet asphalt. She didn't have a specific destination in mind, just the urgent need to be somewhere where there were no cameras, sensors, or electronic voices monitoring every movement. It was when she found herself standing in front of a building she immediately recognized, St. Vincent's nursing home, where her mother had spent the last 3 years of her life, slowly losing herself to Alzheimer's. Eleanor hadn't set foot there since the funeral 5 years ago, but something pulled her toward the entrance. The night security guard recognized her after a few seconds of hesitation. "Mrs. Montgomery." "My God, you're soaked. Come in, come in." She let herself be guided inside the building, feeling the warmth and dryness of the environment like an embrace. The familiar smell, a mixture of disinfectant, flowers, and old age, brought back memories she had tried to bury. "What are you doing here at this hour?" asked the security guard, offering her a towel. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was walking in this rain, alone." Before she could answer, a male voice came from the corridor. "Mr. Johnson, what's happening here?" Eleanor turned and found herself facing a man of approximately 60 years, wearing a nurse's uniform. He was tall, thin, with graying hair and gentle brown eyes. There was something familiar about his face, but she couldn't immediately identify. "What?" "Nurse Anderson," said the security guard. "This is Mrs. Montgomery, Carmen's daughter, remember?" The man stood motionless for a few seconds, studying her face. Then his eyes opened in recognition. "Eleanor? Eleanor Montgomery?" And suddenly she remembered. Alan Anderson, boyfriend from her youth, first love, the man she had abandoned at 22 to marry the industrialist who had offered her financial security instead of passion. "Alan," she whispered, "my God, you work here?" "For 15 years, he said, approaching slowly, as if she were an apparition that might disappear at any moment. "I took care of your mother in the last months of her life. You took care of Mom? She talked about you constantly, even when she no longer remembered her own name. 'My Eleanor,' she would say, 'my girl of light.'" Eleanor felt tears mixing with the rainwater that still ran from her hair. "I didn't know you were here. If I had known, would you have come more often?" There was no accusation in his voice, just genuine curiosity. "I don't know. Maybe. Probably not." She dried her face with the towel. "I was a coward. I couldn't bear to see her that way. She understood. In her lucid moments, she always said that you were too strong to accept her weakness. They looked at each other in silence for a few moments. Alan had aged well, Eleanor thought. There was a gentleness in his face that time had deepened rather than erased. "What are you doing here in the middle of the night?" he asked, "and in this rain?" She hesitated, not knowing how to explain. "I got married." "I know, I saw it in the newspapers." His expression revealed no judgment. "Congratulations." It isn't what I expected." Alan indicated 2 chairs in the waiting room. "Want to talk?" "My shift only ends at 6 in the morning." They sat side by side, and Eleanor found herself telling things she hadn't told anyone. About the loneliness of recent years, about the desperation that had led her to accept Connor's proposal, about the gradual discovery that she had exchanged one prison for another. Alan listened without interrupting, his hands crossed in his lap, his eyes fixed on her face. "Do you remember," he said when she finished, "what we used to talk about when we were young, about freedom versus security? You said that freedom without love was empty, and security without freedom was prison. And you said I was too romantic to understand the real world." Eleanor smiled for the first time in weeks. "Maybe you were right. Maybe we were both." "A little right." He leaned forward. "Eleanor, are you happy?" The question caught her off guard with its simplicity. "I don't know. It's been a long time since I've asked myself that question." "Then maybe it's time to ask." They talked until dawn. Alan told about his life, the marriage to a teacher who had died of cancer 10 years before, the 2 children who now lived in other states, his decision to work with the elderly after his wife's death. "I found peace here," he said. "Taking care of people who are at the end of their journey, it taught me a lot about what really matters." "And what really matters?" "Dignity, choice. The ability to decide how we want to live even when the options are limited." When the sun began to rise, Eleanor knew she needed to go back. Connor would return in 2 days, and if he discovered her absence, "I need to go," she said, standing up. "I know." Alan also stood up. "Eleanor, can I tell you something?" She nodded. "You're still the bravest woman I know. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." He accompanied her to the entrance. The rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to clear with shades of pink and gold. "If you need to talk again," he said, "I know where to find you." Eleanor returned to the mansion, walking slowly, trying to prolong the last moments of freedom as much as possible. The empty streets of the early morning had an almost magical quality, as if the city were waking up just for her. When she arrived at the mansion's gate, she discovered that it was open. She wasn't sure if this was because the system had detected her exit, or if there was another explanation, but she didn't want to question her luck. She entered silently through the service door, climbed the stairs without making a sound, and reached her room exactly when the digital alarm clock marked 6 in the morning. She took off her wet clothes, took a hot shower, and lay in bed, closing her eyes and pretending to sleep. 15 minutes later, the voice of the house sounded softly. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams. How did you sleep?" "Well, thank you," she replied without opening her eyes. But she knew she hadn't slept well, and she also knew that something had irrevocably changed within her during those few hours of freedom. The encounter with Alan had awakened memories of who she was before becoming the woman who accepted golden prisons in exchange for security. In the 2 days before Connor's return, Eleanor behaved like the perfect wife. She dined alone without complaining, responded politely to the house's questions, spent hours in the library reading books she already knew by heart. But in her thoughts, she was constantly back to that rainy early morning, talking with the man she had once loved and who still saw her as someone brave. When Connor finally returned from Tokyo, he found her in the main room, reading tranquilly. In an armchair next to the window, she looked up from the book and smiled. "Welcome back." He approached and knelt beside the armchair, taking her hands and bringing them to his lips. "I missed you," he said, and there was an intensity in his voice that she hadn't heard before. "I missed you too," she lied. "How were these days?" "Peaceful. I read a lot, explored the house, relaxed. Connor studied her face for a few seconds, and Eleanor had the uncomfortable feeling that he was looking for signs of something. "Great," he said finally. "I have a surprise for you." "What kind of surprise?" "One that will ensure you never feel alone again." He took her to the basement, to the control center she already knew. But now there was something new. A chair in the center of the room, made of a material that appeared to be marble, but with golden veins that pulsed gently with their own light. "What is this?" she asked. "Your new reading chair," said Connor, the pride evident in his voice. "I had it specially made for you while I was in Japan. It's sculpted to measure for your body, with sensors that monitor body temperature, heartbeat, blood pressure. When you sit in it, I'll know exactly how you're feeling even when I'm on the other side of the world." Eleanor looked at the chair and felt a chill in her stomach. It was beautiful, no doubt. It was also the clearest possible symbol that her freedom was an illusion. "So you never lose track of yourself," said Connor, echoing the words he had written in the note. She approached the chair and ran her fingers over its smooth surface. It was perfect, ergonomically designed for her body, artistically beautiful. It was also an electronic collar disguised as a gift. "It's beautiful," she said, because she knew that was what he wanted to hear. "Try it." Eleanor sat in the chair and immediately felt the sensors adjusting to her body. The surface warmed, gently molding perfectly to her contours. It was, she had to admit, extraordinarily comfortable. "How does it feel?" asked Connor. "Good," she said. And it was true. Physically, she felt good. Emotionally, she felt like a very well-cared-for pet. But as she reclined in the marble chair, with the sensors transmitting each beat of her heart to the man who called, himself her husband, Eleanor thought of Alan and the words he had said about dignity and choice. And for the first time since the wedding, she began to seriously plan what she would do with the rest of her life. 2 weeks after the installation of the marble chair, Eleanor made a discovery that would change everything. She was browsing the internet on the library computer when she decided to search her own name, out of morbid curiosity to see how the media continued to treat her controversial marriage. What she found left her breathless. Her biography in the main online encyclopedias had been completely rewritten. Where before there had been financial scandals, accusations of mismanagement of the charitable foundation, legal fights with her children, now there was only a gilded narrative of philanthropic success. Awards that she was sure she had never received were listed, with detailed dates and ceremonies. Photographs that she didn't remember taking showed her at events that seemed familiar, but weren't exactly as they had happened. With trembling hands, Eleanor began to investigate more deeply. The news sites that had previously published critical articles about her now displayed laudatory articles dated from the same periods. It was as if history were being rewritten in real time, transforming her into an idealized version of herself. She printed several pages as evidence and went to look for Connor. She found him in the studio, standing in front of a new painting, this time a painting of her sitting in the marble chair with a serene expression that she knew she had never had while in that object. "Connor," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "we need to talk." He turned, a brush still in his right hand, a blue paint stain on his face. "Of course. What is it about?" Eleanor spread the printed pages on his work table. "Can you explain this to me?" Connor looked at the papers without showing surprise. He carefully cleaned the brush with a cloth before responding. "I said I would give you back your dignity. That includes your public reputation. This information is false, Connor. You're lying about my life. I'm correcting lies that were spread about you." His voice remained calm, almost didactic. "I'm creating the version of the truth that should have existed from the beginning. The truth can't be created. It simply is." "Truth," said Connor, approaching her with measured steps, "is a social construction. History is written by the winners, and now we are winning." Eleanor felt a vertigo that made her lean on the table. "You don't understand what you're doing. You're erasing who I really am. I'm revealing who you've always been beneath the slander and attacks." He picked up one of the printed pages. "This, Eleanor, here is you in your purest form. It's you without the enemies, without the envious, without the incompetents who sabotaged your career. And who decides which is the pure version? You? Both of us. Together. I never agreed to this. Connor's voice became harder. You agreed the moment you accepted to marry me. You agreed when you accepted to live in this house, wear my clothes, eat my food. You agreed when you sat in that chair and let me take care of you. Eleanor looked at him as if she was seeing him for the first time. There was something in his blue eyes that she hadn't noticed before, not just obsession, but a type of desperation that bordered on panic. Connor, this isn't love. This is sick. He remained motionless for a few seconds. Then, to her total surprise, he sat heavily in a chair and buried his face in his hands. When he raised his head, there were tears in his eyes. I know, he whispered. I know. It's sick, but I can't stop. It was the first time she had seen him cry, the first time he had admitted any weakness. Eleanor approached cautiously and knelt beside his chair. Why can't you stop? Connor wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving a blue paint stain on his skin. Because every woman I love disappears, he said with a broken voice, and I can't let that happen to you. Tell me about your mother. He looked at her with surprise. How did you... You mentioned once. You said that you found her when you were 8 years old. Connor was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was that of a frightened child. She suffered from severe depression. My father traveled constantly for work, and she was left alone with me in our house in Westchester County. I always knew she was sad, but I thought it was my fault. I tried to be the perfect son, get good grades, not make noise, not bother her. He paused to take a deep breath before continuing. That day I came back from school and the house was very quiet. I called for her, but there was no response. I went up to her room and... His voice failed. She was hanging from the ceiling. Fan. She had left a note saying she loved me, but that she couldn't live anymore. Eleanor felt tears welling in her own eyes. My God, Connor, you were just a child. After the funeral, my father sent me to boarding schools. When he died in the car accident, I was 15 and had already gone through 4 different schools. I learned that people always leave unless you find a way to make them stay. And you thought the way was to control them. It's the only way. That works. He looked at her with desperation. Eleanor, I can't lose you like I lost her. I can't. If you leave, I won't leave, said Eleanor softly. How can I be sure? Because I'm telling you. My mother also said that. At the last breakfast we had together, she said she would never leave me alone. Eleanor extended her hand and touched his face, feeling the warm skin wet with tears. Connor, look. At me. I'm not your mother. I'm not sick. I'm not going to kill myself. But I also can't live in a prison, even if it's golden. Then what do? We learn to trust each other, for real. They stayed like that for several minutes, she kneeling beside his chair, her hands touching his face, eyes to eyes. For the first time since they had met, Eleanor saw Connor as he really was, not a powerful and controlling billionaire, but an orphaned boy who grew up believing that love meant possession. May I ask you something? She said finally. Anything. Tomorrow night, I would like to prepare a special dinner for the 2 of us. Just us, no staff, no monitoring, no technology. Just a man and a woman trying to understand what they have with each other. Connor hesitated. And the security cameras. Turn everything off for one night. If you really trust me, turn everything off. And if someone tries to break into the property? Then we deal with it together, like a normal couple would. Studied her for long seconds. All right, he said finally. One night, no monitoring. Eleanor spent the next day preparing for what she knew to be the most important night of her life. Not just of the marriage, but possibly of her entire existence. It was an opportunity to completely redefine her relationship with Connor, or to end it once and for all. She chose her clothes carefully, a wine-colored velvet dress she had worn decades ago at a gala night, when she was still young and believed the world was at her feet. Miraculously, it still fit her well, embracing her matured curves with an elegance that time had refined rather than diminished. In the kitchen, she prepared a simple but significant menu, the dishes she used to cook when she was newly married and still trying to impress her husband with domestic skills. Shrimp risotto, arugula salad with pears, and a chocolate dessert she had learned from her mother. For the table, she chose the French porcelain that Connor had recovered from the auction, the crystal glasses that had belonged to her grandmother, and candles, many candles, to create an intimate atmosphere that no technology could reproduce. At 7 o'clock, when Connor came down for dinner, she was already waiting in the dining room. He stopped at the door, clearly impressed by the transformation of the environment and by the sight of her in that dress. "You look beautiful," he said, and for the first time his voice didn't carry that usual possessive intensity. It was just genuine admiration. "Thank you." She approached and adjusted his tie. "Did you turn everything off?" "Everything," he confirmed. "For the first time in 3 years, this house is completely disconnected from the outside world. How do you feel?" "Terrified," he admitted with a weak smile, and strangely relieved. They sat down to dinner, and for the first time since they had met, they talked like two normal people. Connor told about the first years managing the inherited company, about the mistakes he had made, about how he had to learn to be an adult, practically alone. Eleanor talked about the early days of marriage, about her youthful dreams, about how she gradually lost confidence in herself after the birth of her children. "Do you regret it?" asked Connor during dessert. "Having had children?" "Never," she replied without hesitation. "I regret not having known how to raise them better, of having let their greed become more important than love." "And if we had children?" The question caught her off guard. "Connor, I'm 80 years old. We could adopt, give a chance to some child who went through what I went through." Eleanor studied him for a few seconds. There was something different in his eyes, a gentleness she hadn't seen before. "You would be a good father," she said finally, "if you could overcome your fears." "Would you help me?" "To overcome the fears?" "Only if you would let me have the freedom to be myself, the real Eleanor, not the idealized version you created." Connor nodded slowly. "Can I tell you a secret?" he said. "Of course. The real Eleanor is much more interesting than any idealized version I could create." After dinner, they went to the main room. Connor put a vinyl record on the old record player, Sinatra singing "The Way You Look Tonight," and extended his hand to her. "May I have this dance?" Eleanor accepted his hand, and they began to dance slowly in the middle of the room, only with the candlelight illuminating their movements. It was the first time they touched with real intimacy, without the mediation of technology or control. "Connor," she said as they danced, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "On the night of the storm when you were in Tokyo, I left the house." He abruptly stopped dancing. "I know," he said softly. "You know? The security system recorded your exit, but it also recorded your return, and it recorded that you returned of your own free will. And you didn't say anything?" "Because I wanted to see if you would choose to stay." He touched her face gently. "And you chose." "I met someone," she continued. "Someone from my past." Connor tensed. "And?" "And he reminded me of who I used to be, a brave woman, a woman who made her own choices. Do you want to go back to him?" Eleanor looked into his eyes, seeing their not possessive jealousy but genuine fear of abandonment. "No," she said. "I want to stay with you. But I want to stay as a choice, not as a prison." Connor pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. "I can change," he whispered. "I can learn to love without possessing. Are you sure?" "No," he admitted, "but I want to try. With you." They resumed dancing, and Eleanor felt something changing between them. The obsessive tension that had always permeated their interactions was dissolving, being replaced by something deeper and healthier. "Eleanor," said Connor after a few minutes, "may I ask you a question?" "Of course." "On the day we met, when I proposed to you, did you think I was crazy?" "Completely crazy," she replied with a smile. "And now?" She stopped dancing and looked directly into his eyes. Now I think we're two crazy people who might be able to heal each other. Later that night, they sat on the sofa in the library, she with her head resting on his shoulder, both observing the flames in the fireplace. The house around them was silent in a way that Eleanor hadn't experienced in months, without the constant hum of the electronic systems, without the background noise of perpetual surveillance. "How are we going to make this work?" she asked. "Day by day," replied Connor, "one day at a time, learning to trust. And the marble chair. It can stay in the basement, as a work of art, not as a control tool. And the monitors? Only on the external perimeters, for real security, not for surveillance. And my online biography?" Connor sighed. "I'll leave it as it is, the true truth with all the imperfections. And if I want to go out alone? Then you go out alone, and I stay here learning to trust that you'll come back." Eleanor turned to look at him. "And if one day I don't come back? Then," he said after a long pause, "at least I'll have learned what it is to love someone enough to let them be free." It was almost midnight when Eleanor stood up to go to her room. At the door of the library, she turned to look at Connor. "One last time. Good night," she said. "Good night, Eleanor, my wife, my choice." "Your choice who also chooses you," she replied. In the bedroom, as she took off the wine-colored velvet dress, Eleanor thought about the strange journey that had led her there. 2 years ago, she was alone and hopeless in a miserable apartment. Today, she was in a palace with a husband who loved her imperfectly, but genuinely. There was still much work to do. Connor would need therapy to deal with his abandonment traumas. She would need to relearn to trust her own instincts after months of constant surveillance. They both would need to discover how to build a relationship based on mutual choice instead of desperate need. But for the first time since the wedding, Eleanor felt real hope, not the desperate hope of survival, but the quiet hope of possibility. 3 months later, on a sunny spring morning, Eleanor woke up and went down for breakfast. She found Connor in the kitchen, preparing scrambled eggs and reading news on a tablet. "Good morning," she said, kissing him lightly on the cheek. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Very well." She helped herself to coffee and sat at the table. "I have a surprise for you." "What kind of surprise?" "Yesterday I talked with the director of the Metropolitan Museum. They want me to curate an exhibition on contemporary American art." Connor stopped stirring the eggs and turned to look at her, his face lighting up with genuine pride. "Eleanor, that's fantastic. Will you accept?" "If you don't mind me spending several hours a day away from home." "I do mind," he said honestly, "but I want you to accept anyway." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure that I want a fulfilled wife, even if that means being anxious sometimes." She stood up and hugged him, feeling the solidity of his body against hers. "Thank you for letting me fly," she whispered in his ear. "Thank you for always choosing to come home," he replied. 6 months after the night of the special dinner, they received an unexpected visit. Eleanor was in the garden, supervising the planting of new rose bushes. She had convinced Connor to make the landscaping less geometric and more organic when she heard voices at the entrance of the house. She found Connor in the main room, talking with a man she immediately recognized. Alan, wearing a blue social shirt and tailored pants, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Eleanor," said Connor when she entered, "your friend came to visit us." There was no jealousy in his voice, just a slightly tense politeness. "Alan," she said, genuinely surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," he said, looking alternately at her and at Connor. "For the way our conversation ended that night. It wasn't appropriate for me to try to influence your decisions." "You didn't do anything wrong," said Eleanor. "Yes, I did. A married man shouldn't try to convince a married woman to question her life." Connor approached, and to Eleanor's surprise, extended his hand to Alan. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For reminding my wife of who she is. She needed to remember her strength before we could build something real together." Alan shook the offered hand, studying the young man's face. "You two seem different from the newspapers." "Newspapers lie a lot," said Connor with a smile. "Would you like to have lunch with us? Eleanor makes an excellent risotto." That was how Eleanor found herself preparing lunch for her husband and her ex-boyfriend, in a situation that should be awkward, but somehow became natural. The three talked about art, about elderly care, about the difference between young love and mature love. "You know," said Alan late in the afternoon when he was preparing to leave, "I didn't believe it when I read in the newspapers that you had gotten married. I thought it was just convenience on both sides." "It was," admitted Eleanor. "But it became something more," completed Connor. Alan looked at them both, studying them with kind eyes. "Yes," said Alan, looking at the two of them, "I can see that it has." After he left, Eleanor and Connor walked through the reorganized garden, observing the rose bushes that were beginning to bloom. "Weren't you jealous?" she asked. "I was, but the healthy kind of jealousy, not the kind that makes me want to lock you in a tower." "And what's the difference?" "Healthy jealousy makes me want to be a better husband. Unhealthy jealousy made me want to eliminate all other options." They stopped in front of a particularly beautiful rose bush, loaded with buds that would soon open into red flowers. "You know what I discovered in these months?" said Eleanor. "What?" "That you were right about one thing. On the day we met." "About what?" "When you said we are two people who recognized each other in a crowd of strangers." Connor smiled, the same smile he had learned to give freely in recent months. "And did you discover anything else?" "I discovered that it's possible to save a person without imprisoning them, and that it's possible to be saved without losing yourself." 1 year after the wedding, on an anniversary morning that neither had mentioned, Eleanor woke up and found a present on the bedside table. It wasn't jewelry, it wasn't technology, it wasn't anything that could control or monitor her. It was a key, a simple golden key with a tag that said, "For all the gates you want to open, and for my heart, which will always be waiting for you to return." Eleanor held the key and smiled. She knew she wouldn't need to use it to leave, but knowing that she could was all she needed to want to stay. That night, they danced again in the main room, in the same place where they had danced on the night that changed everything. But this time, when the music ended, neither of them wanted to stop. "One more?" asked Connor. "Always one more," replied Eleanor. And they continued dancing, two wounded souls who had learned to heal each other in a house that had transformed from prison to home, in a city that had witnessed the scandal of their marriage and now witnessed the beauty of their true love. Outside, New York continued its frantic rhythm, indifferent to the silent miracle happening in a mansion in Greenwich Village, where an 80-year-old woman and a 19-year-old man had discovered that real love neither possesses nor is possessed. It simply exists, free and chosen, day after day, dance after dance, until the music of life finally stops. And even then, they would continue dancing.